All right, welcome back to another episode of Shifting Schools. I am so excited to be here with Audrey and David. David Carpenter and I go all the way back to 2007 when we started this podcast, Shifting Our Schools. David, thank you for coming back and being a guest on the show. And I tell you, it's hard to believe it was so long ago that we got this whole thing started, me living in Shanghai and you living in Hong Kong.
Yes, and those were good days and kind of innovative days that you and I got together at NISA to run a session. And we were definitely birds of a feather, and we agreed on a lot of things, and we put our heads together to start the podcast. And I just remember we didn't know what we were doing, but we knew there were a lot of good people out there for us to interview, right?
Yeah. And, really, that's what I still love about podcasts. I love this, just the organic conversations that you have with people and you get to learn. There's all kinds of ways to set up professional learning networks, and listening to podcasts is one way to learn. And, being able to go out and talk to people is another way. And so I think for both of us, it was a way for us just to talk to international educators at the time and get a feel for what was happening around international education. So it's great to have you back here. In fact, listeners who might be new to Shifting Schools, you can go back and listen. David Carpenter and I did the first 30 episodes of Shifting Our Schools. If you want to go back and see what podcasting was like in 2007 and 8, there's a transition in there from me moving from Shanghai to Bangkok. And I think you moved in there too, didn't you, from Hong Kong somewhere?
Right. I moved to Morocco, where we were using the cellular plug into your laptop to get a Wi-Fi signal. So those were days when the signal wasn't so great. And on that note, I've got to let the audience know I'm in southwestern Mexico, Puerto Escondido, a wonderful beach town, but they do not have good Wi-Fi here. So if I go out, just keep going, and I will try to get back on.
Sounds good. Well, David, tell us a little bit about your adventures as an international educator. It's great to have an episode here focused on international education. We know we've got a lot of listeners who live in other parts of the world, and many who are international educators themselves. What was your journey in places that you lived and taught at?
So I got my start in 1990 in Israel at the Walworth Barber American International School, the year of the Gulf War. And that started my journey, meeting some good friends who are still out there working around the world. A few are starting to retire now. And I would go on to work at 9 more international schools. So a lot of different places. My last post was Vietnam in Saigon, which I loved. I've been to Vietnam many, many times. But throughout the journey, I felt that the community and the schools and the parents and the kids gave so much to me that when Audrey came up with this idea of doing a podcast about international education, and she asked me to join her, I said, I'm on board. I really want to be a part of that, and I want to see how I can give back. So that's a quick synopsis of my long journey and wonderful journey.
Well, and I'm sure, Audrey, welcome to the Shifting Schools podcast. And Audrey, I'm sure you found out, much like I did, that you don't go to David and say, hey, I've got an idea to do something, because next thing you know, you're doing it with David, because he's just that kind of guy. So talk a little bit about your adventures.
Yeah, he just kind of snowballs you. It's awesome.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So, I began in Ethiopia and met my future husband there. And then we went on to Saudi Arabia, where we met David and Margaret. And then from there, Singapore, which those two were long-term places. And then our daughter wanted to try South America. So we said, all right, we'll take a look. So we ended up in Chile, which was fabulous. Then we got to Senegal. Then we were in Italy because we had wanted to get to Europe, although you can't stay in Europe, at least we weren't able to, for a long time because it's really hard to save money there. And then now we've moved on to Jamaica, and this is probably going to be our last overseas location. But it's been a wonderful ride, and like David said, we just really have gotten so much out of this incredible lifestyle where you have the aspect of your life where you're teaching during the school year and just doing incredible amounts of travel and adventure and meeting people from all over the world. And your classroom is stuffed with kids who have such incredible backgrounds. And then you have your part of the year where you're getting back in touch with your, North American roots for most of us and hanging out with your family. So it's just, there's just so much to say about this incredible, wonderful lifestyle that we've had. So I'm
Yeah,
excited.
and I think one of the things to point out is just the incredible people you meet. We know coming out of we just got our Spotify Wrapped data from 2022, and Australia is our second most country that listens to the podcast, with Canada being the third. And one of the things about I always found just so much fun and educationally was teaching from people from other countries. We have a lot of friends now from New Zealand and Australia, and
Mm.
quite a few friends. In fact, Trisha, who my co-host here on the show, who's not here today, is in Canada now with her wife, and that's, to me, part of the fun of being an international educator is just getting to meet all kinds of different educators coming from different backgrounds, and being able to meld those backgrounds together and learning on behalf of yourself and learning for your kids' sake. And Audrey, I'd like to start my first question kind of in that vein of, as an international educator, one of the things I think that I feel, and I know many educators feel, international educators feel, is just the amount of support you have through professional learning and professional development. Can you maybe talk about what your experience was being an international educator and just being able to, quote unquote, up your game?
Well, so initially we were able to go and attend. We were living in Ethiopia. We went to ASA conferences, which is the Association of International Schools in Africa, or at least that was the name at the time. I'm not sure if it still is. And just to go to those conferences, and I've long felt that teachers are our own best professional development, as opposed to necessarily having, an expert come in. And so sharing ideas, and those conferences were a wonderful blend of, they called them keynote speakers who would have a thread that you could follow. And then they had teachers who would do presentations. And I always just gained so much. My head was just buzzing after those conferences. And, I don't know how many people had this problem, but I always found it difficult to choose among all the amazing options that were there. And then just the opportunity, these international schools tend to have professional development. People come in and do workshops at the school. And then also, again, teachers offering workshops in all kinds of different areas. And sometimes some schools will support you in your continuing education. So if you're working on a master's or something like that, and take some classes that the school will help to pay for. So there's just so many opportunities. And, one of the really fun ones I went to was the Shanghai 2.0 type of conferences that you guys were both part of as well. And the learning that could be done at those in terms of technology and personal learning network, and really just exponentially expanding your ability to, self professionally develop
Mm.
is it's really it's what's the word I'm searching for? There's no limit to it once you
Yeah.
start down that path. And so I feel like the international schools have really got their game going on. They
Yeah.
know what they're doing in terms of professional development.
Yeah. And thank you for the shout out to Learning To. People have heard of Learning To on this podcast. It was a conference that I helped to get started back in 2007. And just a quick plug for them. They will be back in person in 2023, November of 2023, at the International School of Bangkok. So anybody who can find the funds to get to Bangkok, it's going to again be just an incredible conference. And David, I want to talk about that because you and I, when we started the podcast back in 2007, we were both in this place where we believed that what we were doing internationally was far and above what was happening in other places. And one of the things that I love is when I go back, and I still do from time to time, go back and listen to those first 30 episodes that you and I did, and the conversations, David, that you and I were having with different people in the international world over 10 years ago are still some of the foundation of conversations we're having today. And I think, to me personally, it just shows the incredible forward thinkingness that you have in international education. What would you say to that?
Well, it's funny you should say that. I'm sitting here nodding my head in agreement with you. And I remember just a few years ago when you started up the Shifting Schools podcast again, and we had Mark on from the EdTech Co-op podcast, and I asked the two of you. I said, okay, Mark's in higher ed, but he's teaching pre-service teachers. You were out doing your consulting around the world, and I asked, well, what's new? What's kind of on the cusp of learning and just making the learning experience better? And you both said, Dave, it's everything we've been talking about going all the way back to 2007. It really hasn't changed. So that was quite a, my eyebrows went up, and I go, well, I think you were probably right. And you and I and Audrey too, we're all instructional technologists. We've done plenty of other jobs as well, but I call us change agents. That's who we are. We come into schools not having all the answers, but what we try to do is reach out to other people, as Mark would say, that distributed expertise, and come together and send people off to conferences, bring in people like you, Jeff, to help us out, and to make change for good reasons. And back to what we were doing, from project-based learning to inquiry to understanding by design, by UDL, that it all made sense because there was research behind it. That was one thing Mark would always bring in to say. So, yeah, and that's kind of, a question, me, I like to ask questions on what are you seeing with your work with the schools in your region in the Pacific Northwest? Do you see the schools kind of in the sweet spot or behind it, or what's happening there?
Well, we're going to get into that question more on your podcast.
Yes, we are. Okay, we'll hold that one then.
Go over to your podcast. Yeah, we'll put that over there. But I think it's where we are right now. I mean, listeners of the podcast have heard me say this. After the pandemic, I think we're in what I call the rubber band effect, where we've snapped back a bit. I'm hearing this in the international world as well, though, that we're, the places where you can still be in person. I mean, there's a lot of things still happening in China and other countries as well. But here, I think in America, we're still in this idea of the snapback effect, where that rubber band got stretched so tight and really pushed us to the extremes of what we were capable of, that there's this human reaction to get back to what was. And I feel like for the most part here in the US, we're still trying to figure out what the new normal is. And we snapped back pretty hard. And I think we're still struggling through that here. But it's not to say there isn't great innovation happening, and we're seeing some things come out of it, ways to be different, and things that we thought were happening in schools that the pandemic pointed out we weren't doing in schools very well. And there's a lot of things around that. And we're going to get into that deeper over on your podcast, which we'll be talking about here. So listeners, if you want to hear more of my thoughts on that, we can go over there as well. One of the things I want to talk about for those listeners, this episode coming out in February, I remember, for my wife and I, when we went overseas for the first time, it's about the time when you start thinking, is there something out there? Are we, what is this international thing that I keep hearing out? Audrey, I want to put you on the spot. When people come to you and say, well, I've heard of international teaching. Is that like teaching English in Japan? How do you explain what being an international educator at international schools is?
You're right. If I had a dollar for every time I've had that question,
Yeah.
right?
I like the
Yeah.
different way that we all answer it. So it's good to get other people's perspective.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Well, I know when I first went to Ethiopia, I used to tease my family. I found a nice mud hut and sent them a photo of me standing next to it and said, "This is my new home," just to kind of pull their chain. But I typically tell people that they're private, typically, American or Western curriculum based schools where the kids have to have a certain level of English proficiency to get in, generally speaking, and that they're really a lot like the school you're in right now in North America, but they are located somewhere else as it just happens. And also that because they're privately funded, they maybe work a little differently in terms of having more flexibility for teachers. I would say, and I imagine you guys would echo this, that teachers have just a little more autonomy in terms of what they're doing in their classrooms. You have quite a bit of opportunity to have an impact, as David talked about, change agents. You can, especially if you're in a small school, you can impact things. And I typically explain that there are schools with, I talk a little bit about the origins of them, although I think that origin story has changed over the years now. And I
Yeah.
guess there are more for profit schools. But when back in the day when we were doing it, they typically were some parents got together and said, look, we kind of really want our kids to be in a school that will have a curriculum that will lead them more seamlessly into being in a North American university environment. And so we're going to create our own school. And so somebody's mom got together the kids, all the expat, either CEOs or government people, and started a school. And they were in somebody's house and there were, 15 kids. And then they grew from there. But that's no longer the origin story, really, so much for the more recently established schools. A lot of them are established differently from that. But those are the kind of things I tend to talk about, that they're really not that different from North American based schools. They're just located somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think from a curriculum standpoint, you're absolutely right. Almost all these schools either follow a U.S. curriculum. If you're a U.S. teacher, very much they follow Common Core state standards, or the new math standards or new science standards. If there are
Era.
Canadian based schools, there are Australian based schools. You can find your schools everywhere. IB based schools out of Switzerland. And they all have, just incredible ways that you can, I don't know, experience the world as an educator. David, is there anything you want to add on, and just like what is it do you think people need to know about international education?
I guess I want to put out there that it's very doable. Like you said, a lot of your listeners are in the US and Canada, or they're working in Australia, or they're working in Britain or Europe in their public schools or private schools there. But the pathway to become an international educator can be pretty clear. It can seem pretty daunting to start the process. And I guess that's why we've started our website, our hub, as we're calling it, that has a lot of different pathways to gather information just to help people who know nothing about international education. But we're also going to be providing a lot of information to veteran educators because, Jeff, you've been out of the international game for a little bit now, and I haven't recruited in a while. It's changed a lot. And when we talk about the profile of schools, I think Audrey just gave a wonderful description. But I'm kind of wondering where they're going to go in a world where there could be another pandemic. How flexible are they? Are they going to offer hybrid programs? Um, so I think there's just real opportunities for change, real opportunities for schools to grow and find their niches, because just as Audrey's saying, there's so many more competitors out there, not just in capital cities, but in secondary cities as well. So I guess that I would add that as my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, I think we can all three throw out there, and I'll open this up, Audrey. We can start with you, and then David, over to you. Is I think when you're talking with most teachers, the first place they think of is like, oh, it would be amazing to live in Italy, like Audrey did. And you're like, yes, it is, and there is, right? Like you're living in Rome, or you're living in Milan, or Florence, or pick your city, and it's amazing. But then there's a financial part to that. But I think most of us, you both were in Saudi Arabia. I was in Saudi Arabia when we got started. And we went to China, and Bangkok was our travels. And I think one thing that I would just add is don't rule out the world. I
Right.
mean, we all get focused because we think that Europe would be the quote unquote easy to live in. But I think it's such an incredible world. And once you get out there and you see and you experience and you actually get to live in different cultures, that's one of the reasons why Dania, my wife, and I chose to go to Saudi Arabia first. We had job offers in a lot of different places, but we wanted that cultural experience. We wanted to be able to be in a different culture. And that's why we were in Saudi. But Audrey, let's start with you. Like, what are some of just that idea of cultural experience and what it allows you to do, as an educator? I think it's something that can't be replicated anywhere else.
Are you wondering if at school, or are you thinking about the travel kind of stuff?
Both.
Or living? Yeah, okay. Well, so in your classroom are going to be kids who have just such a diverse background. They're from all over the place, and it leads itself to some incredible discussion. So, for example, I was teaching health in Saudi Arabia, and initially I was a little worried. This is a bit of a cultural hot button
Topic.
type
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
top issue. But over time, I became more comfortable. The kids were typically, they were used to being in an American school environment, and so they tended to have more, they could flex with their thinking. But I ended up doing, and it was so much fun because the kids taught me. We talk about what these kids give back to you. They taught me about what it's like to be a Muslim and have some of them have, and this is certainly not the case for all of them, but some of them had where, their parents were heavily involved in their decision of whom they were going to date. And also, they weren't really technically supposed to be dating. So I created something called the dating game.
Mhm.
And we had the daters and the non-daters. And the non-daters, meaning kids who were not meant to by culture, they weren't meant to date until they were married. And then we had the kids who were allowed to. And I had them come up with questions for each other. And it was really mind opening where
Mm.
the non-daters taught me some things. For example, if you're not supposed to be dating, there are very clear rules. And so when you do meet someone, if you're in a chaperoned environment, meaning just that there's an adult in the room,
Yeah.
the safety in that is really comforting for those kids. And because, it kind of reminds me of throwback to sort of the 50s where you don't kiss on the first date. It's that kind of thing. When you have clear rules like that, it's actually
Yeah.
kind of nice. There isn't that, and there's no alcohol involved. And so you don't have that piece. So I'm just saying that these kids, it's incredible the kind of mm, cultural experiences that you have within the classroom. You know, um, Maybe there might be an event that happens, and you can have an Israeli kid and an Arab kid and kind of talk it through, and
Yeah.
you can sponsor, if you will, those type or facilitate the type of conversations where you don't just not talk about it, you talk about it in a respectful, mindful way, and you learn so much from each other. So those are the kind of experience that I love in the classroom. Outside the classroom, just being that much closer to cool places, living Saudi Arabia for its cultural strict limitations in some senses, but it's such a hub of
Yeah.
travel. And so we really loved our travel that we had there. And then the other piece of it was because you lived in a compound, everybody was friends with each other. It was felt so safe within that compound, and we all hung out together. It was
Yeah.
amazing. And then the travel opportunities in the area. I mean, who lives in North America can just pick up and go and travel to New Zealand? That's a long, long way and very expensive. And when you teach overseas, you're just that much closer. And particularly if you're a teaching couple, you have the same vacations as your spouse and as your kids, and so you can have all these incredible travel opportunities. One of my favorite adventures was we went and we heard from friends that you could sleep on the Great Wall of China, and so we got connected with this tour and we had dinner with this Chinese family, and then they took us up. The husband took us up to the wall, and we slept on the wall overnight, and peed in a bucket. It was really a cool experience. We got up before dawn and went to the crest of this area where you could look over the wall and take an incredible, some dawn photos of it. My daughter and I went for a run along the wall, just things like that.
Yeah.
And these things expand your mind. And then living, daily life, for example, in Ethiopia, you're walking along the street and there's people, an old woman who looks to be in her upper 80s carrying a stack of wood that I could never manage. And there's people, carting their donkeys along the road, and you're meeting people and just being part of something that is an experience in and of itself in your daily walk to school. So it's just unbelievable how many opportunities living internationally can open up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's funny listening to you talk. My good friend Ashley, who I want to get back on to talk about her international school experience, but I did already interview her. She is, for those of you listening, can go back to episode 96. She's a third grade teacher. She was at the International School of Luxembourg in that interview back episode 96, but she's now in Vietnam. And just to your point, Audrey, is this weekend she was running a marathon in Cambodia. And this is what you do as an international educator. She is teaching in Vietnam, gets out of school on Friday, and because the world is quite small, she flies to Cambodia, spends the weekend in Cambodia, runs a 10K, and is back in time for work on Monday.
Yeah.
And it's those kind of experiences that I think, lead to. I think the other thing to point out is just if you're listening to this, we, the three of us on this call, have, made it a life. I mean, we were overseas for 10 years before we came back, but you don't have to. I mean, most contracts are a 2-year contract, but the things that you can do just even in those 2 years, and I think about, and David, I want you to kind of weigh in on this, but I'll never forget when we came back in 2012. Our last school was the International School of Bangkok, where we had 72 different nationalities. And my wife was a school counselor. She was a middle school counselor. And she came back and she's applying for jobs here in Seattle. And she didn't know how to answer the question on the application form that talked about working with other cultures. Like the standard question of like, well, how do you work from students with diverse backgrounds? And my wife's looking at this like, well, I just came out of a school where I'm dealing with 72 different nationalities. You've got to give me something more than diverse backgrounds. Are we talking a student who has a Korean mom and a German dad? Are we talking Korean kids with Korean parents? Are we like, you can't just say diversity of kids when you're coming from these amazing international schools. They give you experiences like Audrey was talking about. And David, I know you were in counseling for a while. You had sons that grew up internationally. I know there's a lot of teachers who are also parents who worry about their kids going to international schools. Can you maybe touch on some of that of raising your boys overseas and some of the things that you saw from the parent side of thing as well as the educator side of thing?
That's a great question. That was something I was going to kind of lean into as well. So I keep coming back to our website. We're putting videos together, and I just did one about raising your children overseas. So it's fresh in my mind. It's kind of a slideshow of my boys in front of great travel places and in the classroom and learning Mandarin and playing baseball. In Hong Kong, for example. So it's a world where your children are going to pick up a lot of skills, life skills, from critical thinking to seeing multiple perspectives to being really good communicators in general. I'm generalizing here. But when you're in a class, just as like Audrey was saying, with kids from a very different culture, and the teacher brings up a topic and that student responds to it in a way you're not used to, well, over time, you start getting used to that, and that becomes the norm. One of the things that I see with my adult sons now is just how they handle life. For growing up and being in airports and, Dad, can I go get this? Or landing at a place and, do we need a taxi? Oh, I'll get us a taxi, Dad. Or just the nature of so many of these schools that are, as we say, student centered. They all should be, but so many of these schools really pride themselves on putting curriculum together that puts the students in charge of their learning. Personalized learning, we were talking about this in 2008, and it's become a kind of a bigger thing.
Yeah.
But that's all part of the package of raising these globally minded students. Third culture kids is an acronym that we use. So I look back as probably that was the greatest benefit for our family, was to raise Sam and Max, our sons, overseas. And I did want to kind of put a plug into what you were saying about, if you're going overseas that first time, and like you were saying, you look at Europe and, oh, it's going to be comfortable. And one of the things you learn there are cost benefits to everything that you do. And if you were to meet some international teachers and say, where did you have the most community experiences? Where did you feel the closest to the parents, the students? And I can tell you probably 9 out of 10 times, they were in places where people would think, oh, that might not be the most comfortable place, right? That you're going to a place where you're going to be stretched, where you're going to have different experiences, and you're just going to have to get into your stretch zone, to use the counseling term. And after a while, you become more adept at that. So the personal growth aspect of all this is a huge takeaway for anyone thinking about going overseas, no matter if you're towards the end of your career or it's the start of your career. Audrey and I would say, go for it.
I love
Absolutely.
that. Well, let's talk a little bit about your website and your podcast that you guys are getting started. Audrey, I'll get started with you because David said it was all your idea. So I'm sure you've got it all fleshed out exactly how this is going to go. So talk a little bit about the podcast that you guys are starting.
So our main focus is to educate people about international education, what it is, the trends, how to go about it. And, initially my thinking was this would be a how-to for, as you said, Jeff, people that come up to you and say, well, do you teach English to English language learners? And sort of what these schools are all about and what the clientele is and what goes on. And maybe a little bit about some different countries, and then kind of the how-to of the recruiting fairs and so on. And then David said, well, wait, don't we want to appeal to the veteran teachers as well? So, that made a lot of sense. So we're going to also look at current trends and maybe, ideas for relocating, not necessarily beginning the journey, but going somewhere new. And we've actually connected with a international teacher consultant, she calls herself, Jacqueline Millay, and she helps people go through the process. So that's wonderful, both for new and veteran international teachers, to know that there's somebody there who can kind of help you with the whole process. I would have loved to have someone like her. And so we, the kind of something that makes our podcast a little different is, although the podcast episodes will be released serially, episodically, not our idea is to have a library where we're adding them in there as well. So whether or not they've been released, you can go to our website and search under a topic, let's say recruitment, or let's say finances, which is a big one. And then it'll come up with podcasts, blog posts, and then we have a growing resource list. It'll come up with, we're using a system of cards And so it'll come up with cards that have those topics in them. And you can choose, do you want to listen to it? Do you want to read about it? Do you want to go and visit another site that, will give you more information? And then we're also going to post on there, or we already have started to post on there, what we call going global stories, which are some of the stories that, we've shared, what it's like living overseas, the quirky adventures that happen, those slice of life stories, and then the small world stories. Because as you guys both know, you'll be in an airport, in somewhere, Kazakhstan, and suddenly, oh my gosh, there's Sue. I haven't seen
Yeah.
you in 15 years. And or you're deciding, oh, let's travel, let's go to Kathmandu. We'll know someone there, right? I mean, it's insane the amount of connection. So our tagline is actually travel, teach, connect,
Hmm.
because that's a big part for both David and me and yourself, is the connections that you make and how cool that is as well. So we've got 4 parts to our website. We've got the podcast, and you can listen to the podcast there. We've got a blog page where you can read blog posts, and David's our big blogger, but I will add some in time. We have our resource library where you can, search on different topics. And then we have our going global stories. And we're hoping that will, once it catches on, people will say, oh, yeah, I saw, Jeff talking about that time they took a tuk-tuk in Bangkok and got lost in the mountains or whatever.
Yeah.
And I have a story like that I want to tell. And then it'll grow from there, because I think it could be really, really fun to have a hub of these stories, and they can be, informative as well as entertaining for people. So those are the main aspects of the website and the podcast.
I love that. Thank you. And just my quick story on that you never know where this is going to go. You're going to love this one. I was it was after we moved back here. So it had to be like 2013, 2014. I'm at a Seattle Mariners game, and David knows how much I love my Seattle Mariners.
Oh, yeah.
And we're sitting there in the stands, and about the second inning, all of a sudden these 2 girls who happened to be sitting in front of, young women, they're probably 22, 23 at the time. All of a sudden they turn around, and one of them looks at me and says, "Are you Mr. You?" And my wife looks at me, and we're both looking at each other like, "Yeah." She goes, you were the technology person at my school in Bangkok." And I'm like, what in the world? Like, what are the chances that not only are you at a Seattle Mariners game, but they're sitting in the seats right in front of us?
Right.
But you just run into those you realize how small the world is. We ran into some other teachers in the middle of Petra, Jordan one time, to your point. It's amazing how paths cross.
In international schools, it's not 6 degrees of separation. It's like 2.
Yeah, it's so true. So true. Well, David, as you guys are getting this podcast going and we get ready to sign off here, if there are international educators who are listening to this, I love the idea, Audrey, of teachers who come on and tell their international stories. David, if somebody thinks they want to be on your podcast, or they've got a great story to tell, what kind of things are you looking for, and what's the best way for them to reach out to you guys?
I think the best way we'll start at our website, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com, and email us at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com. And we're ready to hear from folks. And we also have a Facebook group. And yes, it's called Educators Going Global, that you can join that and post questions, post topics. In a lot of ways, Jeff, we're just following what you've been doing for many years. So you've been a good model for us and how to make connections and such. So we're just following your lead. I think when they go to the website, that they'll be able to, as Audrey said, go through our major categories, filter them, pull in information. And then if they want to be on the show, if they have some background and they have a topic they want to cover, then just email us or go into the Facebook group and share some information there. And we really, in the end, we really hope to build a community. That's the theme through our talk today. That is, you're both saying the world is big, but no, it really isn't. So we're building our own community there, and we hope people will come on and join us. And as much as Audrey and I have had a lot of experiences, It isn't like we're talking instructional technology where we just really know it super well, or wellness or health. And the world has changed so much with recruiting and what's happened with China in the last year. So we're talking to people and getting a lot of new information about trends, what to expect, or what might happen. So I hope we will become that hub for people who want to learn, or people who they've learned a lot and they just kind of want to nail down what's happening around the world, that they can join us at our website.
Awesome. Well, Audrey, David, thank you both so much. David, as always, it's always great to catch up with you and just see where you're at. You happen to be in Mexico this time. I can't remember the last time we caught up where you were. It seems like you're always traveling the world. So it's always great. So thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules to chat with us today. We will make sure there are links to everything from the website to the email address, the Facebook group in the show notes, making it very easy for any of you that want to learn more. Please do reach out. It's such a great and unique thing that is unique to education, that there are schools everywhere, and just amazing opportunities to, when we say creating global citizens, we have an opportunity to truly do that. So thank you both for taking time today to chat with us. And until next time, we'll see you on the network.